Thank you very much for joining us here as we discuss the Infrastructure Investment Panel. Let me start with you at Indonesia, because Japan is ahead of the curve when it comes to infrastructure. India is still dealing with an infrastructure deficit, as is the case in Indonesia at this point in time. Japan perhaps is dealing with an infrastructure surplus. In terms of public investment on infrastructure, what is the current pace of investment? And also in terms of financing, if you can give us a sense, because I understand that you've got a target of about $480 billion that you would like to spend on infrastructure between 2015 and 2019, and this is largely going to be led by spending on part of the central government. About 30% will largely be driven by spending on account of the central government. If you could give us some sense of the priorities as well as financing.
Talking about the 5-year plan of Indonesia infrastructure development, of course, as you mentioned, we need to raise around more than $400 billion US, and 1/3 might be fulfilled by the government budget, both at the central and local government. And then for the rest, I think it will be borne by state-owned enterprise as well as private sector. So in our case, the budget, at least last year, we have been able to increase the capital expenditure around 45% compared to the capital expenditure in 2014. So at least for basic infrastructure, we will allocate the budget for the development of basic infrastructure such as arterial roads, irrigation, small airports, small seaports, and others. While for more so-called commercial infrastructure, then our state-owned enterprise will take the role. Some of them will be in electricity, toll road, seaport, as well as the big airport. But then we need more private sector involvement. So far, there are quite significant portion of private sector in electricity, power plant, as well as the toll road, but not so much in other sectors. So our challenge in the next 5 years, in this 5 years plan, is how to make sure the public-private partnership will really work in Indonesia. Because so far, we have been trying very hard to make sure
What has
PPP
been the key
working.
challenge? If I could interrupt you, because we just heard Mr. Sinha also talk about the public-private partnership route here in India. 1,300 projects on the public-private partnership side haven't necessarily been very, very successful on account of a bunch of issues, whether it's dispute resolution, it's the change as far as the model agreements are concerned, it's the general economic slowdown, and of course the allocation of risk between public and private. Yes. But what has been the big concern as far as your dealing with it in Indonesia when it comes to PPP?
Yeah, interestingly, when we are trying to formulate our PPP, we learn a lot from India, because we use India as a good experience.
India is not necessarily feeling like they've had a very good experience with PPP, so
that's
maybe you want to look elsewhere.
Good because we are both emerging economies, and we have, quite similar complication, difficulties. So we are trying to learn from India, and we really learn about the risk management. So, of course, the critical issue will be the guarantee. Government cannot be exposed too much to the contingent liability that will be caused by the PPP. So that's why, from the very beginning, we are trying to be so-called conservative when we are selecting the project pipeline that will be promoted for PPP. So that would be one of the reasons. The other reason is the way that Indonesian government works in terms of infrastructure. Because we have been, enjoying the budget, the budget allocation for infrastructure projects for a very long time.
Right.
Then there is a reluctance from the line ministries when I told them, why don't you use PPP rather than using the budget? They prefer using the budget because it is much simpler for them.
Sure.
No risk, and then, they have full control of the projects. So this is actually a big challenge because, again, our fiscal space is still limited.
Right.
Revenue still a challenge. So the leadership from the line ministries is important. And so far, we don't have that many support for the PPP.
Okay, I'll come back to that in just a second, but if I could get you to come in from a Japan perspective on, what perhaps could be the way forward as far as PPP is concerned. I don't believe that India is necessarily the model to emulate, as has been very clearly articulated here by our own minister. But even as far as Japan is concerned, because we've seen the percentage of public investment to infrastructure, the ratio has been declining steadily since the 2000s. Do you, A, at this point in time, feel the need to step up investment on infrastructure, and B, how have you grappled with the PPP dilemma?
Yes, actually in Japan, PPP also has not been successful so far, like India and maybe Indonesia. So we are not really a good example to provide for you. But I think given that many countries are facing very severe fiscal situation and the demand for infrastructure investment to invest in Asia and worldwide, the government alone cannot provide sufficient finance for infrastructure investment. That's for sure. So mobilization of private sector's funding and know-how, not only money but also know-how, are very essential to promote infrastructure projects efficiently. So how to mobilize financing from the private sector to infrastructure projects sustainably? We provide ODA to Asian countries, so we have a lot of experience of PPP. So let me share with you actually our experience of PPP. The important role of the government which accommodates infrastructure projects is to realize feasible risk-sharing scheme. Risk-sharing scheme is a really critical part of PPP that enables, that encourages the private sector involvement.
But Victor and Mr. Mohan, let me ask you this in the context of the fiscal constraints that we're dealing with, and as Minister Sinha pointed out, the need to really look at innovative equity financing. The NIIF is just one example of what the Indian government is attempting to do at this point in time. Let me ask you, Mr. Rakesh Mohan, in your experience now, the NIIF is yet to be operationalized, the process has only about started, but do you believe that that is going to be a successful route to take?
Let me go back a little bit. I think one thing we need to realize, emerging market countries, is that we are actually pioneering in PPP. But you must understand that even though we are told by the developed countries and World Bank, IMF, etc., to pursue PPP, to have more private investment infrastructure, etc., they didn't do it. That is, in all of the United States, Europe, Japan, most infrastructure investment was by the public sector. So we are pioneers in this, and therefore actually it's a more difficult task. It is not something that we are repeating. We are doing new things. We have to do these things because of the fiscal restraints, etc. So it's not easy. Also, to give you an example, the World Bank did a study some years back, about 5 years back, on PPP projects previous 10 years in Latin America. About 80% of them had to be renegotiated within the first 2 years. This is why the minister's announcement of putting a dispute resolution mechanism, something that you have to have. So having said that...
but then given that context, would you say that there is too much emphasis being placed on the need to revive, overhaul, try and push this PPP model through? Because clearly it isn't working. It isn't working in India, it isn't working in Indonesia. And given what you're just saying, then are we perhaps exaggerating the importance of the public-private partnership model as opposed to pure play government spending? I understand the fiscal constraints, but we also have to see the results on the ground.
I put differently actually. We need to be clearer on which areas of infrastructure really need public investment and which areas are suitable for PPPs and private investment. Very clearly, power, telecom, ports, airports are much more suitable for PPP projects because they have clear revenue streams, and ports and airports also have revenue streams in foreign currency. So foreign financing of that is much more suitable also. In areas like railways, roads, irrigation, urban infrastructure, it is much more difficult. There are some mixes there. So, for example, urban water supply, you can have PPP and so on. But even in that, in the Western countries, you don't have that much of, and particularly in France there are, but there hasn't been that much of an experience. So what I'm saying is that to have successful PPPs, one, you need to be much clearer which areas are suitable for PPP and which are not. And then, to the extent that you're clear, look, this needs public investment, and again, as the minister outlined, they've done exactly the right choice. That is railways, roads
and irrigation. Yeah.
Where you have to increase public investment. And I also just want to give some sense of how important this is for India. That, you introduced me as the former chairman of the National Transport Development Policy Committee. I'll do an ad for that. Here's the report of the India Transport Report, which is actually, this is executive summary. There are 5 volumes of it. But the important point there actually is, in our calculations, we found that the likelihood is that freight traffic in India will grow by a factor of 6 over the next 20 years. Passenger traffic by a factor of 15 over the next 20 years. And to some extent we know this because the movie's already been seen in China. That what has happened in China the last 20 years, we will do the next 20 years. This is almost certain. And therefore, this emphasis on public investment in areas where it needs public investment is absolutely right. And as I said, roads, railways, and irrigation. And on the other thing, like ports, airports, power, telecom, which you're already doing, we can do much more clearly into private investment and PPP.
Right. Minister Sinha, let me ask you this in the context of the fiscal constraints that we're faced with at this point in time. And just before we came in, you were talking about how economists have now emerged as a bane as far as governments and policymakers are concerned, and you and Victor can grapple with each other on that front. But you've had to make some tough choices in the quest to be able to achieve your fiscal consolidation roadmap. Governments across the world are dealing with the debt burden, but in India at this point in time, perhaps you're also suffering from another problem, and which is broken private sector balance sheets. So you've got a government that has to walk the path of fiscal consolidation, but you've also got a private sector that's grappling with broken private balance sheets. How do you then try and push ahead? How do you then try and move forward? What is the role that the government can then play?
No, those are very good questions, Shireen, and that's where we have to go from theory to reality. So let me tell you about the reality of some of these projects that I see in front of me all the time, because in my own constituency of Hazaribagh, we have one stretch of national highway from Ranchi to Hazaribagh. It used to take us 4 to 5 hours to go those 120 kilometers. We are doing it now in an hour and 10 minutes. And the amount of commerce, the amount of investment that's happening because we have a world-class highway in that stretch is phenomenal. But then we don't have a ring road around Hazaribagh itself because of contract problems. And then we have another stretch which goes from Hazaribagh to Bari, which is where GT Road comes in. And we have tendered that twice through National Highways. The first contractor, got into a lot of trouble and had to be kicked out. The second time it's been tendered, there's no contractor who's come there. There's concern about left-wing extremism and the coal mafia and all kinds of real-world issues that you have to deal with. So there is a tremendous amount of development risk. There's tremendous amount of capacity constraints that you have in actually getting these projects done. And so while you can set the theory and say, let's put this framework in place and so on, what you really have to do as a government is to try and solve these real-world problems on the ground issues. And we are trying to come up with practical approaches to doing that. So one of the, I think, very good approaches that has been worked on by for example, the roads authorities is to actually give the contract on an EPC basis to a developer, have them do it on a fixed price basis with some cost escalations. And then once that's done, the traffic volumes have stabilized, we know what the cash flow from that project is, then try and bid it out to somebody who will then come in and, and run it and toll it and do all those other things. So we've had to deal with that. The other thing that we are finding, as I said earlier, is that on many of these tenders, particularly in the remoter areas or the areas which are racked with instability, is that we don't have contractors that are willing to take that on. So we've had to make sure that our government contracting agencies like the NBCC and so on are sufficiently strengthened, have the resources to actually execute some of these contracts. So on a day-to-day basis, when people say, okay, where is the road or where is the railway line that you said you had to put in place, we have to find ways of shifting the risk from the private sector to the government, and having the government also step in and execute some of these contracts. And frankly, it's not so much the policy, but the day-to-day, on-the-ground problem solving that you do that actually moves things forwards far quicker.